Hello everyone, this is Nerf UAV, inexpensive 3D reconstruction and view synthesis using RGB camera equipped drones and neural radiance fields. So first of all, I can talk a bit about why 3D reconstruction. Why is it an important part of computer science? So as we as a society head closer and closer towards, this idea of the metaverse, or this idea that virtual and artificial reality play a bigger and bigger part of our lives, what is really important is how do we transition between the physical world and the digital world? So how do we bring objects between the real world and the digital world, right? This is really important in like industries like VFX, for example, where you need digital models of individual humans, or like in the video game industry or the 3D modeling industry, which need a really cheap and quick way to generate 3D assets. Like to 3D scan a model takes about 2 minutes, while to actually 3D model it in Blender, for example, will take about 2 hours, even for somebody very skilled. Right? So this idea of transitioning objects between reality and the digital world. So let's look at how current methods there are to do it. One we have was called a photometric sphere or a light stage. These are basically giant domes that have small cameras on them, and these cameras they basically take a lot of photos per second, and this is composited later in photogrammetry into a 3D model. This is first of all extremely expensive, takes about $500,000 to $1 million, and it's only available for like large institutions like Stanford, like Harvard, like MIT, or like Google. So these are not actually realistic for normal people to use. But second of all, let's talk about phone scanning, which is also getting very popular. This idea that you can take a bunch of photos to the cell phone and then click a button and it composites it all into a 3D model, right? But cell phone is actually really limiting because it can only do what the cell phone can physically see. So what you can physically take photos of. So this prevents you from, for example, accessing like the Statue of Liberty. If you can't take a photo and fly up and get on a helicopter, there's physically no way for you to create a model of that, right? If you create a model of a house, you can't see the roof, so I guess you can't really create a model of the roof. But by using drones, we could actually remove this restriction on what the human mind or the human body can physically do. So because drones can have far easier access to these, especially large structures, right? So let's talk about how we actually control these drones. Um, we use what's called Google's Media Pipe library. This is an object recognition library. So essentially, it will lock onto the object and give out this error term. This error term is determined by the object distance to the center of the image. So by always adjusting for it within this PID controller to the right, or it's called a positional integral derivative calculator, all you need to know is that given a certain input and a certain like goal that it wants to go on, and given a certain error term, essentially, it tells you what is the speed and direction that I need to go in. So because of that, this error term here, we always have the object locked into the center of the frame. And then we shift over a bit along the flight path. Essentially what this does is that it always makes sure the coordinate system, the origin is locked on the object. So this prevents stuff like wind, prevents stuff from like drift, from actually affecting the flight path. And what you actually get here is that this is a series of cameras, right? We use CoMap here, which is this package that can extract camera positions from individual images. And here's a visual representation of one drone flight around the person, in this case me. Then let's talk about nerve. As we have these camera angles, how do we have all these cameras taking pictures of the object, right? So how do you actually transition that into a 3D model? The first step is you run what's called a neural radiance field over it. This is a very new algorithm developed by Google in 2021. So essentially what it does is that given a bunch of camera angles and what the angle actually sees, it optimizes the array. So what it does is that it's actually a neural network that optimizes based on an input coordinate x, y, and z, and an input direction theta and phi, and it outputs the RGB value and the opacity of a certain point. So what it actually does is basically it just spits out with the opacity and the colors at a point, right? What it does is this volume rendering here, which basically gives you the error term that is the color that it actually observes versus the color predicted, and that'll be our error term when we go do backpropagation and we do gradient descent and we optimize the model. So, and specifically saying NERF is a model that is 8 fully connected 256 layers of feed-forward neural network. So it's an artificial neural network. Essentially, what it does is that we first take the input coordinates and do what's called coordinate encoding or positional encoding. Essentially, we do a Fourier transform of this that is represented instead of as an x, y, z point, it's a series of sines and cosines. I don't really know why, but in the literature, for example, they suggest that it's better for detail detection, especially around the edges, around stuff that changes color really quickly. When the object, for example, my shoulder here meets the sky, right? The background and the color changes really quickly, and X, Y, and Z might not be a good representation for it in these cases. But second of all, we also have a last 128 layer at the end. Essentially, the first layers tell you we only put in the coordinates, and that tells you the opacity of the point. And the last point we put in the direction you're viewing the point from, and just tell you the color of the point. The hypothesis here is that each point can be uniquely characterized, not only well, first each point has the same opacity from all viewing directions, but it has a different color value depending on which direction you view it from, or it might have a different color value, and this takes account for it. What it actually does here is this integral here, this continuous integral here, it actually approximates this integral, which is simply taking the color and inputting an array R. It tells you, well, first of all, ignoring this first term here, it tells you, it sums up all the opacities and all the colors along the array, right? So each color along the array is weighed by how opaque it is, so the sigma value here. But then TT here basically calculates how much light actually reaches that point. So if a point is like hidden behind something, it should be taken account into the array, right? Essentially, it just integrates over all previous opacities up until that point and tells you, well, but then basically says how much color is left until that point. Oh, sorry, how much light is left for that point to actually be seen from the angle of the array. And after we get all these sigma values, what we can actually do is that we can compile it into a 3D model using this algorithm here called Martian cubes. What Martian cubes actually does is it takes a bunch of local occupancies and it generates a mesh from that. It's a famous algorithm generated in 1989. Essentially, it just partitions the space in a ton of tiny cubes, and depending on how the points of the cube is occupied, it generates a unique mesh for that cube and rinse and repeat for every partition cube, right? But if we directly apply this to NERF here, or the images that we take from the drone, it's actually really bad because these drone images have noise in it, and NERF deals with noise really poorly. So we need a denoising aspect first. But first of all, this drone noise is actually close to real noise and not close to Gaussian noise at all. And we have really good ways of eliminating Gaussian noise, but we don't have that many good ways of eliminating real noise. But what we could actually do is what we do what's called pixel downshuffling. Essentially, we break the left side, so this input image here, into separate channels. What this looks like is that we break it into its R, G, and B components, and then we retile them on this plane like this in the right. Essentially what this is, it breaks up these larger color chunks caused by corrupted information into smaller noise that is much closer to Gaussian noise. And what you actually get from that is that now we can run conventional algorithms. For example, like, in our case, we ran DNCNN, which is a Gaussian noise eliminator that uses deep convolutional neural networks. Essentially, we just put that on this new image here after we do the pixel downshuffling, and that eliminates any noise. And in that case, we can have NERF run normally. So let's look at the results. We see that our results actually outperform both traditional NERF and NERF PO, which is a faster PyTorch Lightning implementation of NERF that my algorithm is heavily based on. Because NERF here again fails on images with really high noise, we're taking into account for this by doing this pixel shuffling routine and then running a convolutional then running a denoiser on top of that pixel shuffle, right? It actually gives us better image results that are far closer to ground truth. Also, again, aside from the eyeball test, you can also see we outperform on traditional metrics. PSNR is a measure, or peak signal to noise ratio is a measure of image corruption. Our image is much closer to ground truth. We also have structural similarity ratings that are higher, so our image is more structurally similar to the original image as well. Also, we can see from this 3D model reconstruction here that we also outperform a traditional algorithm that called COMAP, which is a Poisson surface reconstruction algorithm that takes a bunch of images and composites them into a 3D surface, right? We see we outperform this because we don't actually see these artifacts, this white stuff around my face, and we don't have this giant hole in my leg, right? This is simply because the neural network has longer time to study the images, and basically it generates takes into account every point instead of simply taking into account things that the camera can directly see, because it also has the power to generate new view angles, right? So lastly, we also see this application to other models I've tested. Here is a pill bottle, here is a flower pot, and here's my room. So you can see this algorithm can really be applied to anything from as big as a room to as small as a flower pot or a pill bottle. And lastly, I have an example here of Stonehenge, where I put myself in Stonehenge. And it's an example of actually applying the algorithm and actually seeing results. So this example of the algorithm being applied to a real world scenario and how it can actually be used in, for example, the metaverse, or in, for example, virtual reality, or in the VFX industry. And with that, I thank you for listening to my presentation.
Hi, my name is Suhana Shrivastava, and the title of my project is investigating the acoustic similarities of auditory elephant turns to optimize currently used techniques. So as a background to my project, why are elephants endangered in the first place? Well, there are three main issues. contributed to why elephants are endangered, which are poaching, human-elephant conflict, and habitat fragmentation. And while these are all really important issues, I'll be focusing on human-elephant conflict. And human-elephant conflict, or HEC, is the opposition that occurs between elephants and the humans living nearby. And the violence that erupts in settings of HEC, such as crop fields, often results in both human and elephant deaths. And as they're confined to smaller areas due to humans moving in and taking over these habitats of elephants, elephants accidentally raid crop fields. And as a result, they get killed by nearby humans who think they are a threat. Playing audio playbacks to deter elephants away from these sites are one of the many methods being researched to mitigate HEC. For example, Dr. Lucy King and her colleagues found that elephants are scared of bee sounds, and when being played, they can be deterred away from crop fields. Also, Dr. Thippel and his colleagues found that 100% of crop raiding attempts could be deterred through playing tiger growl sounds. Additionally, this scientist found that there was a 65% chance of initiating a flight response within elephants through playing matriarchal group vocalizations. However, we still need more research in this field because it is a relatively niche field and very few studies have tackled this area. Additionally, habituation, or getting used to stimuli over time, is still a very big risk. For example, Elizabeth Goodyear found that one elephant's stress levels returned to normal by the second trial, which means that either we need more auditory deterrence or we need more efficient auditory deterrence to combat habituation. Also, there are many ethical concerns with testing. So for example, how do we test without putting both human and elephant lives in danger? And this is kind of where my project comes in. So with my project, I hope to analyze previously used auditory deterrents to look for similar acoustic characteristics between them in hopes of identifying the baseline levels of an effective auditory deterrent to optimize further testing. And so my methods can be split into three main sections. So the first is calculating and retrieving acoustic characteristics. So I was able to receive 10 different auditory deterrents to study, 2 from Dr. Lucy King and 8 from Dr. Vivek Thuppil. And they were bee sounds, leopard growl sounds, tiger growl sounds, lion growl sounds, human shouts, and white noise, which I used as my control. And I used R and R Studio Cloud as my method of making sure that I could retrieve acoustic characteristics and basically analyzing all of these auditory deterrents. And I used the package SoundGen to look for and make sure I was able to retrieve the right acoustic characteristics. I was able to retrieve 114 acoustic characteristics through using SoundGen, and we narrowed it down to 20 acoustic characteristics to focus on. So these included feature-based flux, peak frequency, Wiener entropy, etc. And then the second part of my methods was performing linear regression and principal component analysis. And this was just to identify which characteristics contributed the most towards the efficiency of an auditory elephant deterrent. So I used the LME4 package in R, and I used adjusted R squared instead of R squared in order to make sure that I wasn't overfitting any data. And I used the correlation coefficient threshold of 0.4. So basically, as I was doing these plotting with acoustic characteristic versus efficiency, if the correlation coefficient between them was 0.4 or greater, it was noted down as a significant acoustic characteristic towards contributing towards the efficiency of an auditory elephant deterrent. If the value was around 0.3 to 0.4, the p-value was also obtained. And the p-value, if it was less than 0.05, it was also deemed as a significant acoustic characteristic. And then I did a second round of linear regression with only the bee, white noise, lion fowl, and tiger fowl sounds. And this was just to make sure that I was eliminating any confounding variables, since all of these audio files, when being field tested, were placed 10 to 15 meters away during field testing. And also I performed principal component analysis, and PCA, or principal component analysis, is an analysis technique which helps identify similarities between objects with large amounts of variables. And this is just an example of that to the right. And then finally, I would generalize my results and created basically recommendations for the most effective values of these significant acoustic characteristics. And I calculated this using weighted average, So my general formula was that I added efficiencies and I set them equal to a value called sum. And then I divided the individual efficiencies by sum and set this equal to weightage. And I multiplied the characteristic value by weightage and divided by the total number of playbacks. So this could be either 10 or 6, depending on which linear regression step I was on. And so these are my results. And so as you can see with my auditory deterrence, the white noise was able to have significant acoustic characteristics that were specifically outliers. So for example, the mean Wiener entropy of this white noise was significantly higher than all of the other auditory deterrents with high efficiencies. And this is also the same with this mean feature-based flux. And this is the overall table that I created with all the significant acoustic characteristics. So for example, lowest dominant frequency bands, loudness, the 25% quartile of the sounds, peak frequency, depth of amplitude modulation, and feature-based flux. So these were all significant acoustic characteristics. And these were the adjusted R-squared values and p-values that I obtained, as well as these were the recommended values for effectiveness I created through weighted average. And finally, this was the PCA plot that I obtained. And so just to explain this a little bit, the white noise is much farther away than this cluster over here. And this cluster has all of the highly efficient auditory deterrents. And so, for example, the leopard, lion, tiger, and bee sounds are all very clustered together and are also highly efficient, which means that they have very similar acoustic characteristics and also are similar in terms of their efficiencies. And so just to wrap up this presentation a little bit, the association between the highly efficient audio playbacks and efficiency was kind of demonstrated through this project. And there are also many outliers for specific acoustic characteristics of white noise compared to all of the other auditory deterrents, which further signifies that highly efficient auditory deterrents have similar acoustic characteristics. Some things to make sure that in future research, if they were able to make these errors kind of mitigated, were making sure that there aren't small sample sizes, because this project had only 10 auditory deterrents to deal with, as well as making sure that there aren't too many similar test groups, as this project dealt with 6 felid growls, and due to the similarities between felid growls, this might have affected results in terms of skewing the acoustic characteristics. So thank you so much for listening to my presentation, and I hope you enjoyed it. And these are my credits.
Hi, my name is Dante McClure, and today I'm going to be presenting the origins of China's economic growth, reform and liberalization from the 1980s onward. Shown here is an image of Shanghai's Pudong district in 1990. The next image is the same view from 2010, just 20 years later. The dramatic change demonstrates the unprecedented economic growth that China has experienced in the second half of the 20th century. China is currently the second largest economy in the world, with a gross domestic product of 16.64 trillion, and has maintained an average annual GDP growth rate of 10% for the last 30 years. By contrast, the USA, the current largest economy, has maintained an average GDP growth rate of only 3%, less than half that of China. Even more encouraging have been the welfare effects of China's reforms. From 1980 to 2015, rural poverty in China has been reduced by 94%. The exact causes of this unprecedented growth are still debated, but most economists and scholars agree that they had their origins in the economic reforms that the Chinese pursued in the 1970s and 1980s. This essay investigates 2 key reforms: the household responsibility system and the institution of township and village enterprises as sources of economic growth. It also discusses these reforms in light of China's state ideology and demonstrates the difficulty of understanding the Chinese economy through a simple lens of either socialism or capitalism. The Chinese economy, inherited by the socialist government after the Chinese Communist Revolution in 1949, was immensely poverty-stricken. The majority of the population, nearly 90%, lived in rural areas, many in single-family farms. Industrial production accounted for just 12.6% of GDP. Life in rural areas was difficult. Moreover, the country was badly damaged following a disastrous civil war. In keeping with socialist economic theory, the Chinese Communist Party sought to pursue an industry-heavy, top-down form of economic production in order to rebuild and modernize China. Because agricultural productivity was crucial to supporting the large population necessary for a rapidly expanding and growing economy, the Chinese government pursued a strategy of agricultural collectivization, a system where agricultural yields were publicly owned and distributed. In its initial stages, collectivization proved to be successful. Most of these early cooperatives took the form of elementary cooperatives, consisting of 20 or 30 households. However, in 1958, party leaders pushed for larger scale collectivization. Agricultural workers were joined into vast communes of between 10,000 and 80,000 workers. Management of agricultural laborers was based on a work point system, in which points were allocated for work done by farmers around the cooperative. However, it was extremely difficult to measure and track the points, leading to a general lack of compensation for work done by farmers. Subsequently, farmers lost incentive to produce higher yields, as the return from the government would be the same regardless of the total amount they produced. Ultimately, agricultural collectivization had disastrous consequences. Scholars have blamed the Great Leap Famine, a widespread famine which lasted from 1959 to 1961 and was responsible for a staggering 30 million deaths, the largest such famine in history, on the inefficiencies inherent in China's policies of collectivization. The failures of large-scale agricultural cooperatives led to a new policy, the household responsibility system. In the household responsibility system, farmers as independent entities could contract collective land and undertake large-scale projects according to contracts that they made with the local government. Except for a small part of their profits, which were, as stipulated in the various contracts, paid to the state in taxes, farmers were entitled to all income that they earned through their work. The liberation of productive agricultural forces greatly increased output, signified by multiple statistics. The average prices of China's agricultural sector increased by 42.23% in constant prices from 1978 to 1984, of which economists argue that about half was due to the switch in production system. From 1979 to 2019, the added value of China's primary industry increased by 4.3% annually, and grain output increased by 1.9% annually. The consistent growth in agricultural production output is a testament to the successes of the reforms which began in the early 1980s. While market forces were at play, the economy, both in the primary and secondary sectors, were still heavily collectivized. The most notable example of this would be state-owned enterprises, typically abbreviated SOEs. State-owned enterprises are companies controlled by the Chinese government and are prominent in strategically important sectors, such as energy, telecommunications, and banking. The Chinese government also maintains policies beneficial to SOEs, such as access to cheaper financing. However, many of these state-owned firms face several inefficiencies. One was inherent in the ownership structure of the SOE itself. An SOE, by definition, is owned by the people, meaning currently 1.2 billion Chinese citizens. Of course, there is no feasible way for 1.2 billion people to have influence and control over a single enterprise. So often, leadership positions are given to politically well-connected individuals, and there's a risk of corruption. In addition, as the state subsidizes or otherwise maintains policies beneficial to the SOEs, managers do not always have to completely consider the costs of the project or investments that their firms make. This led to some SOEs making inefficient investments and calls for a new system. Township and village enterprises, or TVEs, provided an alternative model of industrial organization, just like the HRS provided an alternative to agricultural collectivization. A critical part in why the TVEs became more economically efficient compared to its SOE predecessor was the fact that TVEs were not under the direct jurisdiction of their township and village government, abbreviated TVGs, and not local administrators who had ulterior motives and reported to higher-ups in the party. This also allowed for community involvement, as it created incentive for members of respective TVGs to monitor and help TVE management, due to the fact that their community now possessed the right to derive short and long-term benefits from their local TVEs. By 1988, the total number of TVEs reached 18.88 million. The total number of workers employed by the TVEs was 95.46 million, and the gross income from TVEs was 423.2 billion RMB. Over the course of the 1990s, TVEs solidified their importance in the national economy. The GDP from TVEs reached 2,074 billion yuan, equivalent to almost 250 billion US dollars in 1997, which accounted for almost 30% of the national GDP. The taxes paid by the TVE totaled 152.6 billion yuan, 20.4% of the national total. Currently, the activities of the TVE cover almost all sectors of the economy. Many may look at these reforms and infer that China is or was simply adopting a Western style of economic production, and that liberalization has been the root cause of China's stratospheric growth in the second half of the 20th century. However, in many cases, these reforms were less about ideology and more about economic efficiency. China still proclaims to follow the same core values that Chairman Mao established after the revolution, strongly collectivist and nationalistic. This implies that reforms that promote economic growth do not always equal fundamental ideological change. What we can correctly take away from these policies and their results are that regardless of the debates around whether or not China westernized in a sense, allowing individual workers to take control of their work and feel as though they are in control of what they produce have led to immense increases in economic output that is transparent today. Thank you.